Hi everybody, welcome back to English 229, and this is for our class for Monday, the 22nd, where we are in the midst of talking about Frankenstein. But before we talk about Frankenstein, I wanted to draw your attention to the notes below, and you'll see that I've got a note that on Wednesday, the 1st, and Monday, the 6th, I am canceling class because I need to be out of town. So that could be good news or bad news, depending on how you look at it. But this would be a wonderful opportunity for you to get ahead with the readings and also to begin thinking a little bit about the first paper. And as you know, paper number 1 is probably going to be devoted either to Frankenstein, which we are talking about now, or the upcoming Poe short stories. And there are a couple different ways you can do that. You can focus on one short story, you can compare and contrast two short stories, or you can in one way or another address the short stories that we are reading in that particular unit, because there aren't many. Obviously Poe wrote quite a few, but I just wanted to give a selection. And then my suspicion would be your third option would be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because ultimately Dracula sort of straddles the middle point of the semester. My suspicion is that you would be more comfortable writing about Dracula for paper number 2 rather than paper number 1. But certainly if you think you wanted to tackle Dracula for paper number 1, it is a possibility. Just note that you wouldn't be writing about the same text for both papers. And as you know, this paper is a critical paper, so you shouldn't be utilizing outside resources. It's based on your own interpretations and understanding and learning within the course. And it would be approximately 4 to 5 pages, but approximately is just that, approximately. And what I did for both papers is I presented the possibility of you writing about Emily Dickinson, specifically her quotation, "One need not be a chamber to be haunted," and apply that idea to one of the texts that we are reading this semester. But certainly you can create your own paper topic just to make sure that you have that topic approved by me. And of course you can find this in our syllabus and other documents folder, and soon I will be talking about some of the conventions of paper writing as well. Hopefully this is a review because you would have gone through Comp 2, Introduction to Literature. But I still wanted to talk about some of the major pieces. And that first paper, which is due approximately midway through the semester, but I had indicated that I have rolling deadlines, so that ultimately you can make the decision as to when to submit in that paper. But if you haven't submitted in that paper by the midpoint of the semester, you should be reaching out to me to talk to me about your progress and where you might be headed. And that I certainly encourage early papers, and I also encourage revisions of the first paper, as I see the first paper as a kind of learning exercise. And your second paper, the last date that you could hand it in would be the last day of class, so that ultimately you wouldn't be able to do a revision, but theoretically you would have incorporated all of the comments and suggestions that I provided with paper number 1 into your version of paper number 2, so that you wouldn't need to do a revision. So again, I will remind you as we get a little bit closer to the dates that, and this will be posted on Moodle as well, that Wednesday, this will be the 1st of October, as well as, and this is a week and a half from now, and Monday the 6th, those classes will be canceled so that you can work on your paper, and also you can get ahead with your readings, or perhaps even catch up. I had talked about how ideally what would occur, since we're mostly focusing on novels, that even though we've got multiple classes devoted to novel, that hopefully by the first class that we're addressing novel, you would have read that novel in its entirety. It'll just make things a lot easier for you. And then as we are discussing that particular text, you are reading ahead on the syllabus for the next text. So in terms of where we are with Frankenstein, I was hopeful that you would have finished the text before we saw the very iconic 1930s film from Universal Studios that really helped to make Frankenstein a household name and part of our popular culture. But I'm also aware that that might not necessarily be the case and that you might still be working your way through Frankenstein, which is why we've got multiple classes devoted to Frankenstein. But I left you off at last class watching that 1931 version by James Whale. And I hope you noted many of the differences between the film and the text, which is why English teachers probably throughout history have talked about that you could never rely on a film adaptation to substitute for a text. And vice versa. I mean, ultimately, I see Frankenstein's, the film, as a completely different story than what Mary Shelley gave us. And of course, as a literature class and as a Gothic literature class, we're going to be focusing on Mary Shelley's text. But I did want you to see that film because, again, it is so iconic. And by the way, I can't remember if I had mentioned this or not, but Guillermo del Toro is working on, or actually has completed, his version of Frankenstein, which he indicated has been a lifelong desire and project of his. And thus far, I've read very good things about it, so I'm quite excited to see this. But some of the many changes from the film version to the novel version, the first is omission. And obviously when you're watching film, there has to be some condensing because film is approximately 1 to 3 hours long. This one was about an hour and 15 minutes. And whole elements of the book are not addressed in the 1931 film, such as the subplot of the de Lacy family. You may or may not have gotten to that part of the text yet, but it's very important in terms of Mary Shelley's storytelling and her examination of themes, as well as name changes, which might seem a little bit less clear as to why Victor and Henry would have their names swapped in the film version. The best explanation that I can come up with is that the 1930s were a politically sensitive time, and the name Victor sounds somewhat German, so perhaps it was better not to necessarily have a lead character with a German name. But of course, we know it'll be the exact opposite in Mary Shelley's text, where Victor Frankenstein would basically be our main character and Henry Clerval would be his friend. The insertions into the Frankenstein film, and certainly the ending is much more optimistic in Frankenstein's film than it is in the text. Again, I don't want to give away too many spoilers if you haven't necessarily finished the text. And you've got the insertion of characters like Fritz, who's become this stereotypical kind of Igor character in following films, that the mad scientist needs to have some sort of hunchback assistant. One of the more interesting changes, I think, is the credits at the beginning, where we're told that the film is based on a novel by Mrs. Percy Shelley. Now, I also examined this text in my Women in Literature class. I think it's fascinating to talk about gender in this text because we've got a female author who gives us a very male-centric world, and more on that in a bit. But the film version, note that rather than giving Mary Shelley as an individual credit, instead she's references as Mrs. Percy Shelley, which would have been her husband, the great romantic poet. She's not even acknowledged by her first name in the credits, which I think says a lot about gender, especially during this time period. And the biggest change, of course, is probably that in the film version, our villain, so to speak, is supposed to be this creature, this monstrosity. And that's really one of Shelley's main questions in the text, is that what is monstrosity and how do we define that? And we certainly aren't given a creature with a square head and bolts in Mary Shelley's text. That was a Hollywood creation. And even still, when you watch the Hollywood creation and you see the portrayal of the creature, and note that I continually reference it as the creature, not as the monster, and I do that deliberately. More on that in a moment. that what we have is Boris Karloff, the actor who is playing the creature, gives us a rather sympathetic portrayal in some respects. So we get a sense of an almost childlike wonder of this creature. There's a wonderful scene in the film where the creature is playing with a young girl. It's slightly different in the text, and they are taking off petals from a flower, and the creature, not understanding the consequences of not just throwing the petals in the water but also throwing the girl in the water, proceeds to throw the young girl in the water, and she begins to drown. Of course, in the film it's a little bit different, but again, it's more of an error, more of a misunderstanding than any kind of deliberate maliciousness. But this tale, Frankenstein, has never been out of print. So somehow, some way, it has captured the American and perhaps the international imagination. And that question of what is monstrous is one of the major questions. Mostrare means to show or reveal in Latin, and I believe that this text shows or reveals a great deal about us as humanity, and the real monster, so to speak, is really Victor Frankenstein, who first creates an unnatural life and then abandons that life, and humanity as a whole that continually rejects this creature purely because of its physical appearance. And in fact, its behaviors, in Mary Shelley's text certainly, would seem to indicate that the creature is, if not neutral, then perhaps even benevolent, as he tries to help individuals such as the de Lacy family. The novel begins with some literary references, which are important to understand. And in fact, it's important to understand the entire title of the novel. The novel's title is oftentimes condensed to Frankenstein, which, by the way, is the name of the creator, Victor Frankenstein. The creature is never given a name. That is one of the primary responsibilities of parent or parent-like figure, is that you're supposed to name your offspring, which is something that Victor never does because he negates his responsibility as creator. But the title in its entirety is Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. So if you know your mythology, you know that Prometheus stole fire from the gods and presented it to humanity. And this theft from the gods resulted in Prometheus being punished throughout the rest of his existence. And that idea is embedded within the text Frankenstein, with Victor trying to steal the knowledge of the gods. In this instance, it is everlasting life, or creating life from death, and the negative consequences of doing that. And in fact, one of the things that you don't see at all in the film is the unique narration that Frankenstein uses, Mary Shelley's text, that is. Though at the time, it wouldn't necessarily have been that unique to storytell through letters. There's a term for this. It's called the epistolary novel, and it's something that we'll talk about when we talk about Dracula as well. But nevertheless, the idea that we have narrative embedded within narrative is going to be important for our understanding of the text, and that this narrative begins with Walton, a character who is never referenced in the 1930s Frankenstein film, and that Walton too can be accused of being kind of Prometheus, that he's trying to steal knowledge from the gods, he's trying to discover a undiscovered passage, and that he will suffer negative consequences because of this. He runs across Victor, and Victor basically tells his story to Walton, and at least what Victor says, an attempt to persuade Walton not to engage in the same errors, the same arrogance, the same hubris, which is excessive ambition, that Victor himself has engaged in. Though if you've read any of the novel, you'll note that Victor seems to vacillate on that throughout the entire text, that it seems that, yes, he does feel a certain sense of contriteness, but then he also continues to maintain his arrogance and his hubris. That's one of the more interesting things about his character, is how he vacillates. Also, the idea of the literary references right at the very first page of the novel that we've got a quotation from Paradise Lost. Now, Paradise Lost is an epic poem that was written by John Milton. And Paradise Lost is based on the biblical story of the fall of man and the temptation of man through Satan. And Paradise Lost is a very interesting text because in many respects it's rather subversive in the sense that Satan is given a central role in the poem, an epic poem that reads like a novel, much like the Iliad or the Odyssey. And Satan comes off as a more empathetic creature than one might expect. And in fact, many of the ways that Satan is portrayed in Paradise Lost are the ways that the creature is portrayed in Frankenstein, created by God and then not allowed to basically experience the self-actualization that it seeks. But the quote from Paradise Lost, so this is something to keep in mind because this is before the text even begins. Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? The question of Satan asking, did I ask to be created? The question of the creature asking, did I ask to be created? The modern day parallels of all children who are created by their parents, and obviously the children were not necessarily consulted about their creation. And what responsibility does a parent have to a child after creating a child? So we see that. I can tell you that Mary Shelley was very well read, and that another author she references happens to be Christopher Marlowe from perhaps best known for Dr. Faustus, which happens to be the play that I focus my graduate work in. It's Dr. Faustus is based on the German Faust legend of a great scholar who sells his soul for infinite knowledge and the negative consequences that result from that, and that ultimately Faustus continues throughout the story refusing to repent, either because he thinks he has time to repent in the future, or he thinks his sins are so horrific that even God couldn't find a way to forgive him. When Faustus finally does repent is when he is being literally pulled into hell, and it's too little too late. So it's very much a cautionary tale about, well, if nothing else, don't make a deal with the devil, but also the dangers of seeking excessive knowledge. And initially, Faustus wants this knowledge, and he's acquired knowledge in all kinds of disciplines because he wants to make men live eternally, for instance. Note how similar that is to Victor Frankenstein trying to create life from death. And what happens at Dr. Faustus is Dr. Faustus squanders his time, and we can say that Victor does the same in some respects. But even if you don't necessarily have a literary background, you can appreciate part of what it is that Mary Shelley is doing with the epistolary novel technique, with the use of letters for storytelling, which always leads to the question of the reliability of the narrator. So one of the biggest questions in this novel when we begin is how much can we trust the veracity of this tale? Because ultimately the entire tale is told from one perspective, Walton's. Because Walton is telling us what Victor supposedly has told him. And there is no definitive proof that Victor actually even exists. Walton is in a pretty poor state emotionally and mentally and physically. He is feeling isolated, on the verge of a mutiny from his crew in the Arctic. But even if Victor did exist, we know that what Walton is doing is taking Victor's story and then after the fact, writing it all out to letters to his sister. And think about all of the possibilities of error, misrepresentation, misremembrance. This will also be important when we get to the creature's tale, because the creature's tale is told through Victor, and Victor is telling his tale to Walton, and Walton is writing down this tale to his sister, Mrs. Seville. So again, the creature is through Walton's perception. So even if Victor does exist, let's say, we aren't guaranteed that the creature exists, because we know that Victor, like Walton, is also in a very similar situation. He's in a poor state, physically and emotionally and intellectually. And of course, we find out why over the course of the novel. So, of course, this leads to the question of, reliability of narrator. I can tell you that usually after we sort of play around with the idea of how reliable or unreliable the narrator is that we usually accept the narrative for what it is. But you can't really understand Frankenstein if you don't understand the narrative levels. It's almost circular, a circle embedded within a circle. And this is a level of complexity that you are never given, or rarely given, in Hollywood, I should say, and certainly not in the 1930s Frankenstein film. Both Victor and Walton are filled with ambition. Walton wants to discover an undiscovered passage, and Victor wants to be able to create life from death. Both of them are filled with hubris and arrogance and want to be able to do something no one has ever done before. Both are lonely and isolated, oftentimes because of their own actions. And notice how both reject female in their life. We see that Walton has basically left his sister. He's writing letters to her, but it's a very distant way of connecting with her. And she's referred to as Mrs. Seville. The idea that, again, during this time period, that she would be seen as kind of property of her husband, which is why this is such a great text to examine in a women in literature class. We'll see the same with Victor with Elizabeth, whom he eventually gets engaged to, and that ultimately he keeps postponing their marriage because he's so busy with his scientific experimentation. And this is one of the ways that I've argued that this very male-centric novel, women aren't major characters, and oftentimes when they are characters are portrayed in stereotypical roles. This is one of the ways that I think that the text is a feminist novel in some respects, because ultimately it's an examination of what happens to a male-centric society when female is rejected or oppressed. And if there had been a greater presence of female, I suspect Walton and Victor wouldn't have gotten themselves into some of the difficulties that they have experienced. You might have also noticed in the novel that there are long passages that are devoted to discussing nature and Mother Nature. And nature is oftentimes viewed as feminine, hence Mother Nature. And if we wanted to see Mother Nature as a kind of character, and note that Victor finds, as does the creature, comfort in the world of nature, and it's only when they isolate themselves from that there are some pretty negative consequences. So perhaps our major character, our main character, isn't Victor at all. Perhaps it's Mother Nature, and that would be a female-centric novel and all of the benefits associated with Mother Nature. We had talked a little bit about how Percy Shelley had suggested to Mary Shelley in her initial draft that she expand her text. Some of those expansions include these long descriptive scenes of nature, which would not have been unusual during the time, the Romantic period, as it's called, when authors would celebrate the natural world and comment on it. And certainly her husband Percy would do that in his poetry. But again, I think thematically we can see nature as a feminine force, and that makes the text interesting from a gender perspective. It is a morality tale. And again, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but the pursuit of knowledge without thinking about the consequences is definitely an issue for both Walton and also Victor. And as we continue on thinking about the actual novel itself, the adoption of Elizabeth, for instance, is somewhat problematic because Elizabeth is adopted because she's fair. They're as progressive as Mary Shelley can be about difference, about the other, that which is different from ourselves, which is why the creature is rejected. And oftentimes there can be contemporary parallels made with racism and classism and sexism, rejecting that which seems different from oneself without allowing the opportunity for connection, which is what the creature experiences when it's rejected purely for its physical appearance. But Mary Shelley also has her own biases as a European. It's definitely a very Eurocentric text. And that said, Mary Shelley was a very young author who sometimes maybe asked us to suspend disbelief a little bit too much. There are places where the writing is not as smooth as it could be. One of my favorites is when the creature just happens to find a satchel of books in the wilderness and is able to use those books to help itself learn how to read and write as it is watching the DeLacy family teaching reading and writing to a new member of the family. And certainly we have to suspend disbelief that you would just happen to find a satchel of books in the forest, and that said, that you could actually teach yourself how to read and write, because these texts are some of the most complicated texts in literature, including Paradise Lost by John Milton. And anybody who has studied them in the classroom knows that it's probably highly unlikely that the creature would teach himself how to read, write, and be able to understand those texts in such a short period of time. But again, we suspend some disbelief. Now, one of the things we talked about in terms of the Gothic are some of the conventions associated with the Gothic. And one of the conventions is that there are possible supernatural elements associated with the story, but it's ambiguous. So for readers who perhaps want to pursue a more naturalistic explanation, there usually is an out, so to speak, for them. But the occult references in Frankenstein, because Frankenstein is oftentimes read as a science fiction text, and we had talked about genre blending when we had talked about the Gothic, because Frankenstein could be a scientific tale about the limits of science and the consequences of scientific discovery. But whether or not science will ever have the capability to create life from death, reference to things like the Philosopher's Stone, which you might know in reference to Harry Potter. It is a supernatural belief of being able to achieve everlasting life through a kind of talisman, in this instance, a stone. Or if you know anything about Cornelius Agrippa, who was known for his occult teachings and his occult learnings, I would qualify that enough to have supernatural elements. Certainly there are elements of the macabre, while we don't get many details about Victor wandering around, digging up graves and corpses. Certainly that does lead to the idea of the death and decay that's associated oftentimes with the Gothic. And I just wanted to reference the first few chapters in Frankenstein, especially if you are still in the midst of reading the novel, that these letters to Mrs. Seville, Walton's sister Margaret, indicate, and I've just selected a few quotes, Walton's physical and mental state. The first, in letter 1, Walton says, quote, "I prefer glory to every enticement that wealth placed in my path." And these are one of the many lessons that we are supposed to learn in this morality tale, that there are negative consequences to thinking that way and acting that way. In letter 2, Walton says straight out, "I have no friend, Margaret." And he goes about how he is going to visit unvisited regions. And of course, you could say that that isn't only just literal, but it also is figurative, because this examination of this story is our examination of, let's say, unvisited regions. And in letter 3, Walton asks, "What can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man?" Or as I like to say, and I think every scientist should consider this, just because you can, that doesn't mean you should. And think about the modern day parallels with the science that Mary Shelley could have never anticipated. Things like cloning or artificial insemination or artificial intelligence. Just because one can achieve something, what will be the consequences of that? And oftentimes science focuses on the achievement and not necessarily thinks about the ethics, the morals, or the consequences. In letter 4, Walton talks a little bit about coming across Victor in the open water, and that Victor was not, as the other travelers seemed to be, a savage inhabitant of some undiscovered island, but a European. Again, there's that European centric bias that we know with Walton, and also that we know with Mary Shelley as well in the telling of her text. And Walton and Victor in letter 4, as we see both of their stories, and we hear that Victor suffered the domination he should not acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race. Unhappy man, do you share my madness? So this is Victor's lament about the errors of his ways that he doesn't want Walton to follow. And yet oftentimes it seems like Victor does and says the exact opposite. So we'll discuss that more next class. In letter 4, Walton says about Victor that Victor is a slave of passion. And I might argue that that is true of all of our central characters. It's true about Victor. It's true about Walton. It's even true about the creature. And then in the first chapter, we get Victor's story. It's told in the I in the first person. So it's easy to forget that what we're getting is an embedded narrative. This is Walton's reflections on what Victor told him. And we always have to keep that in mind. Victor talks a little bit about his childhood, about he was their parents' plaything and their idol, and something better, their child. Rather ironic, actually, on 2 levels. The first, if Victor was treated so well as a child, one would think that he would treat his own child, or his own creation, the creature in this instance, well, which is exactly what does not happen. And then, secondarily, notice how he refers to the idea that I was their plaything, and the idea of possession and objectification, which is how Victor sees the creature. And in fact, Victor also sees his future fiancée, Elizabeth, something that's there for his benefit. In chapter 2, Victor says, the world was a secret to me which I desired to divine. It was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired. Of course, that gets us back to Prometheus at the very beginning, and the consequences of trying to achieve forbidden knowledge. In chapter 4, Victor says, I shun my fellow creatures as if I'd been guilty of a crime. And isolation is always a major theme in the world of the Gothic. Community is one of the ways that the Gothic can fight against the horrors of life, whether they be literal or figurative. And the idea that Victor says it was as if I was guilty of a crime. Victor is guilty of many crimes. Stealing corpses, creating life from death, abandoning his creature are just a few on the surface. So Victor, I would argue, never truly takes full responsibility. Chapter 5 is when we get the iconic creation scene, which I'll talk a little bit more about next class. And that's that dreary night of November, very Gothic, and is ultimately the impetus for the story, because that was the nightmare that Mary Shelley had initially. And then basically in chapter 6, one of the places where I think that perhaps Mary Shelley is a little bit awkward in her writing, if I might say so, is that in a letter, and again, notice how much of the story is told through letters, from Elizabeth to Victor, Elizabeth says, Justine, you may remember, was a great favorite of yours. And this seems to be an awkward way to introduce the character of Justine, because if Justine was indeed a true favorite of Victor's, he wouldn't need to be reminded of that, now would he? So that's really for us, our benefit as readers, to understand that we are going to be introduced to a character named Justine, and we'll find out how she's important as the text progresses. Basically, it turns out that she's accused of a crime, killing William, Victor's brother, and it's a crime that she's not guilty of. It turns out that this is the creature who is killed out of revenge, Victor's brother, because Victor has abandoned the creature. And then the creature has basically found a way to make it seem as if Justine is the guilty party. So Justine does confess, but she says, I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution. And think about the importance of the church, especially for female, during this time period where Justine feels the need to confess a lie because she's told by church figures that she will die in everlasting fire in hell if she doesn't confess, even though she's not guilty. And again, when we think about some of the pillars for female during this time period, piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. The importance of being pious has basically made Justine, or at least made her feel compelled to confess for a crime that she's not responsible for. And then when we're introduced to the creature in chapter 9, we see how incredibly articulate this creature is, which gets to part of the question of an age-old debate, if you study science or psychology, or both, nature versus nurture. How much of our behaviors and our personalities and our temperament is based on our genes, our nature, as opposed to our environment, which is nurture. Usually we talk about a combination of the two. If we were going to talk about this creature, and notice that in the film version of Frankenstein, a brain that is abnormal is stolen and put into the creature. Nothing like that occurs in the actual Mary Shelley version. But when we're introduced to the creature, his first behaviors show benevolence. He wants to help other individuals, such as the DeLacy family, and he has a great appreciation as well for nature in the natural world, which can be viewed as the feminine. So from those perspectives, we see that it would seem that the creature is either born as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, or he's born with a certain level of goodness that is destroyed when he's confronted with the evil of humanity. He teaches itself language. We see an incredible intelligence here, the creature. He uses reason, and he compares himself to two characters in Paradise Lost, not just the Satan character, but also Adam, another one of God's creations that ultimately is able to inspire God's wrath and God's abandonment in many respects. So, hopefully by the next class you would have finished Frankenstein if you haven't done so already. And if you'll see in the notes below, I have what's upcoming, and what's after Frankenstein is a series of short stories by Edgar Allan Poe. Certainly not comprehensive, but The Fall of the House of Usher, The Mask of the Red Death, The Telltale Heart, and The Black Cat, classics by Poe, just to give us a sense again of American Gothic, because Mary Shelley is obviously British Gothic. And of course, reading a short story and interpreting it and writing about it is somewhat different than a novel, which we will discuss. But for those of you who wanted to get ahead, now those are the next set of readings. And what's left is our attendance question for today. That would be due on Wednesday. And if it turns out that you cannot complete your attendance question by Wednesday the 24th, just ask me for an extension. I'll be happy to grant it to you. And my question, since I talked a little bit about quotation thus far, depending on how much you've read, identify an important quote that you found in Frankenstein, and more importantly, why you think it's important. So you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peer responses and my responses in turn, which I will be offering. That should give you a good idea of not only some of the major important quotes in the text, but also the class conversation that we would be having. So next class, we will continue to discuss Frankenstein. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on with Frankenstein. Take care. Bye-bye.